Okay, so yeah, what I'm going to show you guys is basically moving from Dynamesh to ZRemesher model, or a model with new topology. So again, usually my first step is to go in and duplicate my head mesh. So I usually do this piece by piece. Now I just have this kind of crappy demo I did for the hair earlier. So I would do each one on its own, duplicate the mesh. But for now, I'm going to focus on the head. I'll turn off.
So I have to duplicate the head, the hair, the eyebrows.
Yeah. So I usually do each piece on its own. The head by far is the most important one, but all pieces should, maybe with the exception of the eyeballs, I'll work on. So I'll show you a couple of steps. Let me just turn off Dynamesh. So I usually turn off Dynamesh, and then I usually like to rename. So under the subtool palette, I'll rename the head here to Remesh. So there's a few ways you can start. One way is to just literally start right off the bat by Z-remeshing. So if you go into geometry, Z-remesh, you have a target poly count, and then there's this thing called adapt. So what that basically means is that the target poly count is the number of polys it'll try to aim for, and this is in thousands. So think on the assignment outline, I've asked you guys for between 7,000 and 10,000 polys for your low res. Adapt is kind of great and sometimes not great. Basically what it does is with this button on, it will analyze the surface, and anything that's higher detail will put more polygons in automatically. I'll just turn off the fill color for now as well. So it's a little tap option here, so we can turn off that fill color just so we can see what's going on. So sometimes I just start with the default options. So it'll try to hit 5,000, but adapt will override this, and again, where there's more detail, it puts more polygons or more edges. So this would be, let's say, one variation of Z-remeshing. And you can also remesh a remesh. So if you like it, but the poly count's high, you can slide it lower and remesh it again and remesh it again. So this is one way to go about laying out the topology, a half-decent topology. Now, it's not terrible, but it's not great either, right? So sometimes you get these loops that sort of spiral along. You see that it kind of goes diamond-shaped over this edge area, and it's just over 11,000 as well. The bottom eyelid seems to work, but the upper one does not. Loops around the mouth are okay, but again, they kind of go into this little diamond shaped area here. So one thing you can do is go into B for brush, Z for Z-remesh, and there's Z-remesher guides. Now if you remember the combo, you can go B for brush, Z for Z-remesher, and if you look in the upper left corner of each little button, there's an R, so you can go BZR as a kind of quick combo shortcut. So what this allows you to do is to say, you know, I've tried a Z-remesh, it kind of failed a little bit along here, so I'm going to actually put a guide where it's sort of not working great. And I know, so I mentioned this to you guys before, right? We want sort of circular loops around the eyes and a circular loop around the mouth, so I will often sort of trace the lip line. And then I may put another sort of circular loop around the mouth here. And we also want this sort of area. I often refer to it as the Robin mask, right, from Batman. So we often want something like this. We also typically want loops that kind of radiate out. Usually from the middle of the eye, we want to connect to the outer third of the lip. So sometimes I'll try something like this. And now the guides will actually have an influence when I hit Z-remesh. So it'll try to create topology or edge loops based on that, on those guides. Again, it's not always clean, it's not always perfect. But this, it's turning a lot better. It's still going a little bit sort of weirdly spiral over here. So, by the way, when you're drawing these, if you hold Alt and draw across, that actually will cut that part of the curve. And if you want to extend out, if you hover near an endpoint, you'll see a little red line connecting, and it'll allow you to keep drawing and create a sort of connected loop. So I'll try this one more time and see what results I get. And I may often go lower, so I'll show you this in a second. I'll jump over to a little Word doc to explain this. So we'll see what results we get. Yeah, again, it's a little goofy around the eye there. So the mouth area is generally a bit better. It's very close to ready for topology, but again, we get this weird sort of looping happening down here. And again, I usually like to have circular loops around the mouth. So if I go back to, let's say, Pinterest, right? We want something that's a bit more circular and looping around. So I usually like to have 2 to 3 loops that go outside the lip area, 2 to 3 loops to define the outer area of the lips, but they're all circular. And we should see these edges fanning out. Again, my general rule is in the corners of the eyelids, the corners of the mouth, I usually like to have 3 loops coming out, and then the rest are sort of fanning out from the bottom horizontal edge and the top horizontal edge of the upper and lower lip. Same thing with the eyes, right? They kind of fan out. Another trick that I usually like to use is, so if I just open up Word, I'll show you guys this in a second. So my target poly count in this case is 10,000 polys, right? And you can work. So if I work on this model, right, it's 11,000, 11,500. It's a lot of mesh to work with and to try to fix. So for example, in this area, maybe this loop doesn't, I don't like the way it sort of splits off. So I could use a little low poly modeling like I would in Maya in Zbrush, or I can export this to Maya and attach these two and maybe start to draw new loops. But I find a lot of times if I'm working at 10,000 polys, it's just a lot more work. So every time you divide a model, right, 1,000 polys when it's divided becomes 4,000. All right, and then if you divide that again, or smooth it, I guess, if we're using Maya terms, that 4,000 will become 16,000 polys, right? So I tend to work backwards. So if my target is somewhere in the 8 to 10,000, let's just say it's, yeah, I'll say it's 10,000 for now, because that's what your assignment is for the max. So that means if I want to work on this a little faster, this would actually be a base of 2,500 polys. So I actually like to work lower poly because it's faster. So what I'll do is I'll start at 2,500 polys, or try to get to around that area. So my range, or the range I give you guys for the assignment, is 7,000 to 10,000. So that means if I really want to be fast and efficient and get this out of the way quickly, I should start on a head that's roughly, I guess it would be something like in the neighborhood of 1,800 to 2,500 polys. Right? So then when I divide it, then it'll be in the range of roughly 8,000 to, or 7,000 to 10,000, right? Okay, so there's some other issues too. So when you guys give me the next version, I also will typically delete the bottom polys here because these are unnecessary. They're unused. So I'm going to show you guys some tricks, some additional tricks. So you can use ZRemesher guides. That's one way to work with this stuff. Another way you can deal with this, or to work faster on this, is to actually create polygroups. So I'm going to turn on the fill option again, so we see the color. So depending on how you modeled, you might see different groupings for the ears and stuff. So if the ears were kind of glued on, right, you might see them as something like this. There'll be a different color. Okay, so polygroups are often created when you're using like combining different meshes and dynameshing together. It'll leave behind sort of color codings for those separate pieces. If you ever want to make a polygroup, you can hit Control W, and I can hit it multiple times and get different colors, right? And there's two kind of major ways to create polygroups in ZBrush. So one would be to let me just hit Shift F so I turn off the wireframe. But if you hold Control, right, and mask an area, and hit Control W, it creates a new group. Okay, so Control W on a masked area creates a new polygroup. And if we're using, there's a select rectangle, which by default, when you open up ZBrush and hold Control Shift, this allows you to hide or unhide parts of the model. So if I Control Shift, click and drag over this section and hit Control W, that visible area now becomes a polygroup.
When you talked about the poly count, what part did you say you don't need? Is on the bottom, right?
Yep. Yeah, so in a typical production model, you know, if you're building a head for a character, usually heads are often kind of built or split off separately from the rest of the body. You know, usually because there's a shirt, a jacket, some other clothing on top. And so the head mesh tends to be kind of floating, sitting inside of those clothing areas. And then oftentimes when we set it up for animation, we use either blend shapes or a rig, and sometimes a combo. And so oftentimes when you make blend shapes, it's actually literally just resculpting the head into different positions where the mouth is open, the mouth is closed, the lips are moving a certain way, the eyes are blinking or squinting or creating wrinkles in the forehead. So it's often done in production where we have the head as almost like this sort of separate floating piece. So again, anytime where there's mesh that's not visible, not seen, we would actually just delete it. That's one of my plans for this thing, is to delete the open mesh. The other thing is I want to create polygroups, because I can, if you take a look over on ZRemesher, there's a button that says Keep Groups. So what it'll do is it'll look at the mesh's polygroups and create new edge loops based on those polygroups. So I'm going to just go kind of area by area and sort of like in these little tutorials, right? You see these little areas that are kind of color coded. So I'd actually build something like this in polygroups, and then when I hit Zremesh, it will create loops. So my eyelid area was a problem, right? My lip area wasn't ideal either. So a lot of times I'll switch to something like Skin Shade 4, which is a little flatter, easier to see for polygrouping purposes. So I'm going to hold Control, which is mask paint or mask draw. I may just hit Shift F so I can see the masking more clearly. So I really want to get right up to that edge, and if the painting is a little bit messy, then I'm going to just hold Control Alt, which paints out the mask, so it subtracts from the mask. So Control, and then holding Alt to kind of really refine the edge a bit. And there's a couple of shortcuts for this as well. So you can Control Tap, which blurs the mask. Control Tap on the model. Control Alt Tap sharpens the edge of the mask, so it gets really, really sharply defined. So it's another really, really good sort of trick for masking. So yeah, I'll just touch up this area a bit. Okay. So I'll just work on that as best I can. Hit Shift F, and then if I hit Control W, right, that becomes a new polygroup. So some other sort of tricks is to hide and unhide groups. You can hit Control Shift and tap on a polygroup. It isolates it. Control Shift tap on it again, hides that same group and leaves the rest behind. So next up, I want to create probably that bigger area around the eyes, so sort of the bony structure here of the sockets. One thing you'll want to be careful of too is sometimes when you're masking, the mask will go back through to the opposite side. In this case, it's actually not happening, which is good. But if it goes through the backside, like let's say I do the ears because they're really thin, it might project through to the backside. What you can do while holding Control, so when you're holding Control, you're technically activating a separate brush. And by default, that brush is a masking brush. Yeah, it's right here. It's a little button called Backface Mask. So I'm going to turn on Backface Mask while holding Control. So that means that setting is on per brush. So other brushes, if you use like clay tubes, for example, and I brush, and you'll see it'll go through potentially through the backside. So if I use the clay tubes, right, it can pull from the backside. So if you turn that option on, it'll recognize that you really only want to brush from the one side. So yeah, for some reason it's still sneaking through a bit, but generally speaking, that should work to prevent going through the backside. So I'm going to hold Control and sort of mask this eye socket area. I'm going to sort of, again, I like equal spacing on this stuff too. I find you have to kind of balance what's happening in the anatomy versus the distance too. One of the reasons I say that, like you want equally spaced or fairly evenly spaced topology, because areas that have really, really high density mesh or edge loops that are close together, they will cause potentially a pinching in the model when you start to smooth it. So we want to try to avoid that sort of effect if we can. So yeah, I'm just going to bring this back a little bit. It's weird, didn't get an update there, it's odd. Okay, so I'll hit, let's just double check. There's nothing on the back, so that's good. Hit Control W. So now we have two polygroups, right? So I'm going to do roughly the same thing just to start with the lips here. So I'm going to just mask the sort of lip line area. And hit Control W again, and then I'll isolate that. Hold Control.
How do you isolate them?
Control Shift Tap on the polygroup.
And by tap it's just click, or it's...
Yeah, so you're just holding Control Shift, and then you use your pen or your mouse and left click, or just tap with the pen. Yep.
What was the question?
Oh, the question was how do you isolate the groups, the polygroups? It's Control Shift Tap once to make that group visible, and then Control Shift Tap again. So I can keep going and hiding polygroups this way, right? Now, remember what I said about the bottom. So again, I've got back face mask on. I'm going to just quickly hold Control and then double check. Yeah, this is probably okay. I might just Control Tap on this once, maybe twice, or just gently remove that from the upper edge there. So now I've got, right, one area. If I Control W, we got a new polygroup there, right? So polygrouping can be a really, really fast and efficient way to get your loops on. You just have to make sure you turn on Keep Groups. I mentioned this as well, the adaptive density. You can turn this off so you get closer to your target poly count range. And I tend to go to the lower end of the range. So in this case, I want to be 7,000. Chances are it'll still go above that to like 7.5, 8, 8,000, 9,000. And then I'll hit, oops, not divide, hit ZRemesher. And now the sort of edges should sort of flow a lot better with the edges of those poly groups. So that does give me generally a better result. You know, the mouth is a little better, right? I'm at 13,000. If I Control Shift and hide that, I'm actually back to 11, right? So this is not a bad way to get pretty good quick results at a base. You know, there are some strange things happening in here too. You know, it's not a perfect result. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll say, let's just try and literally hit ZRemesher one more time to see if I get a better result. Yeah.
The reason you don't have the actual eye included, that's because it's for the ball, right?
Right. The ball is on its own. I start with a basic sphere, so I don't need to go rebuild the sphere, right? So you can see too, like the lips are a little bit problematic, but I'm actually getting better results in most of this area. So sometimes that means I'll have to do a little bit of manual editing and tweaking to this, some manual cutting. So So I can sort of smooth this out a bit. I want to show you guys one little trick here. This is amazing. If you go to B for brush, Z for Z modeler, and then hit M. So that's the kind of combo, BZM. Or you just click on the brush here, Z modeler. This tool is actually like Maya's modeling toolkit built in a ZBrush. And if you just hover over a polygon, it does extrusions. If you hover over an edge, it actually does insert loops. So it actually inserts a quick loop through all the parallel edges that I'm hovering over. And if I grab on vertex, I think it's just on the move option. So you can get a lot of really great kind of Maya style functionality inside of ZBrush here. You just have to hover over. So right now I actually want to weld. I'm going to set my draw size really, really low, by the way, so I know exactly what I'm dealing with or hovering over. But let's say I want to like stitch these two loops together. So I can hover over vertex, hold the space bar, and now I can do stitch. 2 points. Tap that point, tap that point. Now it's welded. So instead of doing all this extra work in Maya, you can do a lot of this kind of fixing and tweaking inside of ZBrush, which is really, really fantastic. So same thing here. A lot of times I just want to doing a little bit of stitching or welding to clean some stuff up. In this case, I may want to maybe split or insert a loop here. So I'll go insert single loop. So I might try that here for now. If you want to take this, so I'm hovering again over edge loop, you can say I want to slide this loop, complete edge loop. So you have to pick the target. It could be a single loop, a complete edge loop, or a partial loop. And I can now slide this to space it a bit better. Remember what I said about distribution, making sure the edges are evenly spaced, right? So this is such a great kind of method to, I'm just holding shift, by the way, and smoothing out some of this stuff to get more even distribution of polys. Same thing in the chin. You know, sometimes you get these weird little pinches, so I'm just going to try to fix that. Okay. And remember, I've got this base down here I don't need, so I'm going to Control-Shift tap on this once, Control-Shift tap twice. Got a little bit of weirdness down here too, so I may clean or delete that. So I'm going to hide that, smooth this out a bit. And then what I can literally do is go to, I've got a delete hidden button. So I've added this to my interface. I'm going to give you guys a new version of this later, but to get that, you have to go to Geometry, Geometry, Modify Topology, Delete Hidden. So it's going to delete those hidden polygroups. So those are gone. Now remember, I've still got the old head there. So let me go back into Solo so you can just see the head I'm working on. Go to Geometry. Sorry, not Geometry. Subtool, Project All. Now I don't care about the painting that might be on there, so I'm going to say no to that. So I'll get back into Solo here. So sometimes I do want to doing a little bit of kind of nudging, so I might use the move tool, you know, move the lip line up, get it close to where it should be. So, you know, the edge of those lips should trace the actual anatomical edges that I've got. Let me try Project All again. So it's going to get closer and closer to that shape, right? So this loop, I'm going to just use the move tool, get that lip line working correctly. Project All again. There we go. And so now that lip line is starting to trace a lot closer, right? So yeah, sometimes there's a little bit of push and pull, a little bit of nudging. You know, sometimes I have to slide this stuff. I might distribute this better. Remember what I said, more even distribution gives you better results, right? Less pinching, Project All. There. So now we're actually starting to see that shape come through. One thing you can do, sometimes if you get weird sort of splotchy areas in the head, you might want to increase the projection distance. So it'll grab from a further distance between the two surfaces and try to project better. So I might just play with that setting a little bit. Project All. Okay, so I think that's okay for now. If I hit Control D or go to Geometry and Divide, again, I like my shortcut, so I usually hit Control D. Project All again. Right now we're getting that shape coming in a lot closer. Control D, and I usually do this step by step. I go up a division, I project. I go up a division, I project. So let me step up, Control D. So I think up to 2 or 3 subdivisions, Project All. So now, right, if we take a look at the two models, here's my new head with subdivisions, a base and a high res. Click on the other one, they're identical, right? So this is the Dynamesh, this is the non-Dynamesh. So again, one thing I want to look out for, if you take a look at this line, this is the line from the low res. So I'm going to hit Shift D to go down in low res, and I want those lines to follow, right? These lines should follow much more closely. So I'm going to just sort of tweak the lip line a bit more here. There. So we get, right, much more of a correct kind of tracing of that lip. So move that up. And do maybe project all. So I might have to step through again and project all a couple times. Yeah.
Is the temperature in here fine?
Yeah, I think it's F5 that's still dicey.
Okay, you guys cool. But here it's still good?
Yeah.
I'm just going around to all the labs. I know I'm in F5 so I can feel it. It's horrible.
Yeah, it's freezing, eh?
But this one's good. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
So yeah, it's just it's it's a little bit fine tuning, a little bit of going back and forth and just kind of getting things to sit in the right spot. But once that's done, you got something close to a production ready mesh that's ready to go. Now the ears, I should have fixed this earlier. I should have looked at this, but you see they're kind of going up. Sometimes you get this weird twisting with a ZRemesher, so I should have probably gone back and done a guide just for the ear. So I would have done one sort of arcing guide along that area. The other thing I have to do, so this thing is still over the limit, right? Poly limit. I'm going to show you guys some really interesting tricks here for simplifying the mesh. So one thing I will often do in the sort of shoulder neck area is reduce the poly loops. So what I mean by that is if I go back to B, Z, M for ZBrush Modeler, hover over an edge, I want to actually delete. I can do delete edge loop complete. So I'll kind of pick a loop to start from. Oh, this thing has subdivisions, right? So I have to actually delete my, remember what I said about freezing and subdivisions? When you edit a mesh at this resolution, you often have to either freeze. I don't usually like freezing. I'd rather usually delete my low or my high. Since I still have my other more detailed sculpt from Dynamesh, I'm simply going to switch tools and delete my higher subdivision. So now if I go in here, maybe I'll try this loop, right? Deleting that loop doesn't affect the profile too much, and I'll pick every second loop. So I can very quickly erase out some mesh, right? And be careful. It's one thing that's a little tricky with this tool. You might want to do this with a mouse rather than a pen just because it's a little touchy. If you don't hover exactly over an edge, it'll extrude a poly, you know? So if I look at the poly count, I'm actually already down 2,000 polys right now, basically. Might even delete that edge. So I'm at 11,000. Okay. I may want to do the same thing here. The problem is, you know, it's a little. It might go through the whole eyelid area. You see how that loop goes from the upper to the lower eyelid, right? And it takes out way too much. So I want to be careful of that. I will show you guys a little trick here. So I'm going to go to Vertex. Go to. I'll try to stitch, I guess. So I usually do this where the hair might cover part of the head. So I would go maybe up past where the hairline would be. And yeah, just click on one vertex, stitch it to another, and do the same thing over here. Okay, and then if I go to edge, I'm going to go to delete edge just to delete a single, just make sure it's on single edge. So I'm going to hold space bar. So when you're in ZModeler, the space bar is it's like your right-click menu in Maya where you go, you know, bevel, extrude, merge vertices, collapse, that kind of thing, right? So what you basically have are two sections, the action and then the target of that action, right? So I'm going to go delete edge in this case. So I want to delete this interior edge. So this leaves me with four-sided polys, right? So that's actually really good practice, is to always make sure you have four-sided polys as much as humanly possible. It just gives you good, clean, predictable results. And what I'm going to do with this, just to show you guys this, is if I go to what's it called? Delete edge loop complete now. I think this should work. Yeah, maybe I'll do edge loop partial. Yeah, it's being a little goofy here. Let's just delete. Yeah, I'll delete this edge. Let's see. Collapse polyloop. So I'm going to go collapse polyloop. I'll try this instead. There. And unfortunately, this is, I think, where, yeah, the modeling tools in Zbrush are okay. They're not great, but, you know, usually what I basically do is try to get rid of the two edges that are coming out here. So what happens is you got three loops coming into one loop, basically. So I'll just show you that quickly here. So this is kind of the idea that I kind of want to get to. So, right, these three loops are going to terminate into one. So let me just go back to delete. Oops. Hover over edge, go to delete. Let's do polyloop complete. There. Yeah, it's a little goofy. Don't like what it's doing there, but so as I go, if I were to do that, reduce the mesh down, right? Sort of simplifying what's happening in the back of the head here, because we don't need all that mesh, all that detail in the back of the head. All the detail really needs to be focused in the front of the face up into the forehead, right? And I could still probably delete a few more loops in the neck. Again, just to sort of streamline this. Sometimes, a lot of times what I'll do is if I don't really like the tools or the results I get in ZBrush, I'll actually just export this to Maya to sort of help clean it up a bit. So I'll show you guys that in a second. So remember, even if you're smoothing out, averaging things out, you can go back and do a project all again. So right now I'm just over 10,000, right? I'm doing pretty good. So I'll show you guys an example of this. I'll do an export. Yeah, by the way, our software versions are a little bit mismatched. Like ZBrush, this version, normally you just hit Go Z. And it would export directly to Maya, directly to Photoshop. Unfortunately, the version of Maya we have and the version of ZBrush we have, they're a little incompatible, unfortunately, but just going to quickly get this thing set up. So yeah, you can try to do like a one-click export and it should send it out. But in this case, like I said, the way the lab's set up, you basically have to export an OBJ object. So I would export an OBJ. Unfortunately, Maya will just kind of load it blankly because there's some issues with Mental Ray not being installed. It's no longer the regular renderer. So yeah, it's a little unfortunate. We have to take a few more steps to bring your mesh in. But so I'll just finish this part showing you a couple of Maya techniques. But I find this is probably the fastest way for me to get a good, clean topology without having to do a ton of work. You know, it just gives you production-ready mesh in the shortest amount of time. So yeah, let me go back to this. I'll double-click on my tool and go to Symmetry and switch this. It should be on Object X, so I believe that will be correct. There we go. So yeah, I typically want to keep these cross loops here, so I'm going to just take these two out. So this is one method. Like I said, you can do this sort of method where you do I basically take two edges, collapse, take this out, double-click this, right? So these loops will simplify if I control backspace. You have to hit control backspace, by the way. If you just hit backspace, it leaves an ungodly mess of vertices behind. So the vertices stay, but the edges are gone. You don't want to do that. You want to hit control backspace so that it takes the vertices with it. So this is one way to simplify mesh, you know, in a lot of areas. So sometimes I'll do that with these areas in the lower chin jaw region. Sometimes I'll do that. So this is one of two techniques. I'll show you another technique that I love to use. So this is where we take, right, one loop, three loops collapsing down to one, right? The other method I use is I take 4 loops, so something like this. I'll go to multi-cut. Sorry, let me just deselect here. Go to multi-cut. You cut from one corner into a mid-poly edge into here. I'm going to take these 2 edges, control backspace, and then double-click these 2 interior edges and control backspace. And check that out. So now we take 4 loops and drop them down to 2. In either case, I'm reducing the poly limits, right? And that actually simplifies the mesh in areas where it's just not needed. And if I go to display, heads up display, poly count, I can now see the exact poly count of this mesh. So you usually want this on if you're working in Maya or if you're working in Zbrush. You want to sort of know what the poly count is up to, okay? So yeah, I'd probably start to do it somewhere down in here as well. So I might just sort of start to find loops that can be collapsed. So yeah, maybe somewhere over here again where the hair would hide this, I'm going to collapse those edges, take this one out. Yeah, this is a little bit of a weirder result. So I'll just go take the loops instead of the rings. There we go. And then yeah, sometimes too I'll just take 2 parallel edges, so you can actually collapse parallel edges down as well. So this thing kind of goes into the forehead. I can just try to do a merge collapse, right? And that's not
so the eyeballs, the hair are not included in that poly.
No, I'm really strictly focused on the poly count on the base of the head itself, okay? And remember, bottom is open. Again, I usually like to avoid, you see this area right here, it's a little denser. They're a little closer together. So a lot of times, you know, I look at spacing as well, and I will be grading the spacing of your loops so they're consistent. And it's difficult. You know, you've got a dense area in the front, and it's got to more gradually space out in the back. So a lot of times I'll go to transform constraint, edge slide. So let's say I take this loop right here. I'll slide it over. So if I edge slide, you see it kind of maintains the curvature of the surface without sort of disrupting. You know, I'm kind of maintaining basically the curvature and the forms in the head. So I'd probably go through and do this all the way across, right? Whichever method I do, I would keep kind of following across and simplifying that mesh. Control backspace, right? So we really get a streamlined head. Like I said, these loops are fairly good here. One thing I usually don't like, you see there's kind of a little diamond shape happening here. So sometimes I will have to do a little bit of manual editing. So I'll take this loop, merge and collapse that edge. So the main idea is that I want to be able to double click and select quickly around the loops of the eyes. So here it breaks down a little bit again, right? So I might just take these, merge and collapse. And then I could say, maybe I'll try something like this where I take out those 2 edges. So I get pretty good circular loops around the eyes. This for me is still a bit of a problem, but a lot of times I use a little bit of hack and slash, which is a lot of people ask me like, oh, how do you figure this stuff out? I'm like, I just cut and weld and merge until it works. There's no secret to my madness. So if you take a look at that, that's sort of working. And if I maybe take this out, you know, a lot of times I keep pushing the problem somewhere else. It's a good technique for life. Just shove the problem elsewhere until you can deal with it. Yeah, so sometimes it requires more manual cutting. So I'm thinking, you know what, maybe I need to actually cut this edge loop in here. You know, and the main thing is I want to maintain good circular loops around the eyes. That's really important. And at some point it becomes a loop around the whole area here. This, you know, it should sort of follow along. It's traveling out a bit, but yeah, something like this, right? This is kind of the robin mask that I was talking about. And you can see, again, it goes kind of diamond shape here. So my method to fix this is to merge, collapse, and then I might repeat that over here. So yeah, it does take a little bit of finessing, you know, a little bit of sort of tweaking and touching up. Sometimes a little bit of manual cutting is involved. And then I can, yeah, take those edges out. So now I get the closer to that robin mask effect. So let me just merge and collapse that. So yeah, a lot of times I'm just like, you know, I'm going to figure that out later. I'll deal with it later. All right. So that's pretty good topology. You know, sometimes, again, these these really dense areas. The nose is actually a really great area to kind of hide stuff or to fix stuff. So a lot of times I'll kind of cut across like this. Oops. Let's try that again. Now this is a little more old school. Again, you guys can use quad draw if you want to preferring it. I don't mind, you know, that. And I'm going to post a tutorial for you guys on that. I personally don't use it that much, but a lot of times I'll just cut what I really want in the mesh. So I'll say, oh, you know, this loop I think should come across more like this. Now this looks like an ungodly mess, but I'll show you how I fix that. So I literally just double click the bad loop and control backspace it, right? So now I'm left with more clean loops that are not warping and dipping down in some weird ways. I can literally just kind of cut the new loops that I want in the way that I want. So that's kind of the method to my madness, I guess, is to just kind of cut and clean up the loops the way I like them and not have to kind of manually move and slide stuff over. I'll just double click the bad loops and take them out, you know. And you can hide more loops in this area. So what I mean by that is that, you know, in the browse we often have very complex areas where there's some, you know, creasing and folding and stuff like that. So yeah, let me just merge that. There we go. I'm going to merge this. What's going on here? Yeah, let's take this out for now. I'm going to collapse this. Take these and collapse. Okay, so you see I've got this little triangle area, so I'm going to show you a little trick. For browse, when we have animation, we often want areas that crease. So I'm going to just show you what's left behind here in a second. So now I can have, notice this technique that I'm using, right? I want to leave behind as many four-sided polys as possible. So this area now allows me to have a crease line here. So if I, let me turn off the edge constraint so you can actually see this. If I turn this off and I pull that edge inwards, and I hit 3 so you see it smooth, right? I can get kind of like little folds and creases in here. So having these little sort of tricky areas. So if you ever get stuck with a triangle and you push it into this area, it's actually really great for kind of allowing you to get creases and folds and whatnot into the inner browse, basically. So yeah, a lot of times I'll sort of cut in, or you can even take like let's say some faces here like this, and do an extrude, but instead of extruding outwards, you want to do an offset. What? It's way too high. Let's do minus 0.01, or maybe plus 0.01. Oops, 0.01 positive. There we go. So this can be actually a good way to, right? We're maintaining quads, and this, you know, when you crease or like you have an expression in the face where you're like thinking, and the brows pinch in and kind of gets dimpled and wrinkled. These extra loops are really, really useful. So yeah, sometimes I'll do that too. I can run those loops up into the head. So I usually like to kind of keep them running upwards. But and if you take a look here, I've got when you've got two triangles next to each other, take out the cross edge if you don't like the look of it there. And yeah, so we should basically have some nice kind of good loops around the face here. Okay, let's take that out. Okay. Okay, so that's just kind of a basic overview of some of the editing I would do in a head mesh. You know, the lips too. I'm not going to get super strict about a lot of this stuff. I do want sort of, again, good circular loops around the eyes and the mouth. So if you ever get this sort of weird triangle issue happening, again, you'll often have to collapse and make sure, right, as you select around, that these things can actually flow into a circular loop, basically. So I might actually collapse this loop here. So yeah, there's a little bit of manual editing involved in this process. You know, will take a bit of time to get the hang of. And it does involve a lot of manual cutting and some merging. So if I now double click around the outer loops of the mouth, they should basically start to flow into good circular loops. Okay, so let's pretend this is done. Actually, I'll fix this area up here just quickly. So Zbrush, by the way, doesn't like anything with triangles, by the way. It doesn't really hates triangles. Most 3D software actually is kind of designed to avoid triangles. I'm going to leave this area a little bit messy, but I would normally kind of do the same process I'm doing. I just don't want to bore you guys to death, so let me export this back out. Export selection. And then, oh, where did I put it? Let's see, I want to make sure I'm exporting OBJ, remesh. So it's really interesting about Zbrush. I just want to show you something. So I've got this version of the topology here, right? Let's say I divided it, projected it. I'm going to do that right now. Geometry, project all, or sorry, subtool, project all. Okay. So I've got this, right? Let me divide it maybe one more time and project again. So this is one of the great things about Zbrush, also one of the dangerous things. If you have an active subtool and it's very identical or very close to identical to this mesh, if it's got the same name as this subtool, when you go to import the mesh, so I've got the new polygon layout, it says this mesh contains, well in this case I've got some triangles and quads that I should fix. I will just say quads and triangles for now. I believe, yeah, it just basically swaps the mesh out. Normally it would actually keep your divisions and everything, but for some reason it just, yeah, it sort of swapped it out. That's odd. Strange. Yeah, one thing I can try. Let me undo actually. I'm gonna see. Usually what I would do typically is grab the mesh and hit Go Z, and it should send it right over. And it's being really buggy right now. It's all right. So yeah, I'm gonna bring this head back in by just importing. For some reason, like I said, there's some weirdness going on where it's scaling it down actually. Let me get out of solo mode here. If you come across this issue, this is probably a good thing that it comes up. If you come across this issue, what I would usually do is just simply scale the head up, and you may have to reposition it. So I'm going to use the move tool. Normally this should come in at the same size, the same positioning, but for some reason it's a little off from Maya. And if you really want to match it, you can turn on this transparency mode, so it kind of gives you this sort of almost like silhouette, right? Just take the size down a touch as well. And then move it, nudge it into position here. Yeah, you want to be as close as possible. Let's get out of that transparency mode for a sec. Okay, so I'm now going to go in and do another project all, right? So I can go subtool, project all. There. Let's solo that. So that's looking pretty good. Yeah, let's hit divide, Control D, divide a few times, project all. So that's kind of the process in a nutshell. We just want to kind of get a good clean mesh with better managed topology, better distribution, more focus on the face, and yet not lose our sculpting detail, right? So I've got the best of both worlds. I've got a new organized mesh. And so right now I'm projecting from my old Dynamesh to this new 500,000 poly divided mesh. And let me delete the old Dynamesh. Now I've got the remesh. What's great about this is that you see, you know, all the stuff that's left behind from Dynamesh, it's sort of a mess. Well, now you can actually go in now and start to smooth this out, work out some of those weird glitches and bugs, smooth it out, maybe divide it another time. So now I'm in 1-2 million polys, and now I can start to do really subtle, detailed sculpting. So this is sort of my process, right? I Dynamesh to a certain stage, and once I start to hit a limit where I really need to get in and start doing more refined work, you know, then I'll sort of be able to step up and down in resolution and sculpt, right? So now I've got this immense amount of power using the best worlds of low poly controlled mesh, right? So I can still go down and say, oh, you know what, these lips are a weird shape. I need to fix those lips and reposition them. I would just go to the lowest subdivision and reposition them if I really needed to change the head, right? What's also great about that is that if you need to make expressions for, so later on we're going to do things like blend shapes, right? So now I can actually start to do blend shapes that actually focus on the expression. It's a little creepy, but right. So now you know I have that control at low res that I wouldn't have with the Dynamesh. Okay, so that's basically method one. I'm going to quickly show you guys another method for doing this work, this kind of work. So let me reload or load the other tool that I had. Yeah, let's see. I think this one here. So it's a lot of the same techniques. I hope you guys realize. Like, it's actually, it seems a little complex. There is some technical work that's going on there, but it's basically, you know, the first like 30, 40, 50% of a project, I'm dynameshing. Once I'm ready to get into smaller details, I duplicate, ZRemesh, maybe touch up the topology a bit, and project. So I never lose anything, and I can move to a new version of the model that's getting closer and closer to production ready. So I want to show you guys one other method. So instead of actually doing the cloning and all that, you can actually go into Brush, hit T for Topology, and then if you want, the combo is O, BTO, Topology Brush. So if you don't want to deal with like editing, welding, cutting, and all that sort of stuff, you can literally just kind of go to one of my tabs on Pinterest and find a good base template. This at the lowest res is probably one of the better layouts. And you literally draw with this curve tool. By the way, a smaller curve brush gets a finer curve line. A bigger curve brush gets you kind of a simpler, chunkier curve line. So right now I'm drawing with a mouse, which probably isn't the best, but I'll just show you this method. It's really great. Draw a loop. Draw another loop. Again, I keep it about equally spaced. Doing a bad job of drawing with a mouse, but that's okay. So once you get a complete loop and you start crossing over, it starts to put in quads, which is kind of genius. And remember what I said earlier, right? I usually like 3 loops coming out at the corners of the eyes. For some reason, this is getting really nasty too. So usually I don't fill in the inner part of the eyelids because that gets hidden anyways. And if you want to trim off excess, you hold Alt, and it should trim off some of the excess. Now you may, in fact, need to draw some lines here just to kind of keep this thing sort of satisfied, but you know, this isn't the best tool either. I find it can be a little bit buggy as well, so I just want to warn you guys. You can try this method. It's not bad. It's just not always ideal necessarily. So yeah, it's doing some really weird stuff right now. Try that. So you see I'm literally just drawing across, right? And it's generating a topology, which is actually pretty powerful on its own. So remember what I said, you can work at a low res mesh that's almost like 2,000 polys and do simplified versions of this. And if I hold Alt and cut across, right, it's going to leave behind this topology. And if I hover over a green dot, I can hook in and get more topology this way. So you guys might prefer this. This is basically like the quad draw method of Maya, basically. So let's do something like this, right? I usually follow this line here. And again, if you want to hook up with that line, keep drawing. Try to draw across the center. There we go. And if you break that line, right? Again, a little messy sometimes this technique, but What's great about it is it gives you super simple topology as well that you can kind of then refine through this drawing method, right? Let's do the lips. Oops, that was a bad line. So this can work. Like I said, if you guys really prefer this sort of drawing method, I think it's not a bad option. Usually these loops from the sides of the mouth. So let me just Alt trim off some of the excess from some of these bits. Right, it's a really bad drawing. Yeah, so these loops, usually the 3 loops kind of come off from the corners of the mouth out to the sides and up along the jawline. I usually like to have another loop that, at least one other loop that encompasses the mouth, usually 2. Right? You guys see how quick this is too, right? It's a really, really great method. And again, any line that's kind of broken, you know, you can just keep extending and drawing it out. Now you may wonder, well, how do I get from this weird grid thing that's going on to proper mesh? So let me show you that in a second. I'm just going to do a simplified version of this so we can kind of move on. By the way, nose, really tricky area, but I think if you pick a simplified guide, you can literally almost trace this onto your head mesh. Okay. So again, I don't know if you guys would prefer this method or not over the ZRemesher, but there we go. Now, chances are I would probably keep doing more lines in here for the nose, but again, I just kind of want to move on so you guys can start to practice this stuff. So yeah, once you're done drawing something like this, you basically want to click off of the mesh and it'll generate a surface. Now you see it has a thickness, right? If you set your draw size to 0, this will be a thin poly surface. So the thicker this draw size is, the thicker this piece becomes. So you can actually do armor this way, body armor, bracelets, jewelry, like all sorts of stuff, right? Hopefully you guys are starting to realize how awesome Zbrush is too. It's kick-ass. So yeah, I would set my draw size to 0, click on this, and then I believe we want to go to split unmasked points because this new mesh is masked, the other parts are not, so I'm going to say split unmasked points. We now have that face. Remember what I said about working in low res? You can basically divide this, right? So we'll pretend this head is 1,000 polys or 500 polys for the whole head, or 1,000 polys. You know, if you divide it once, 1,000 becomes 4. 4 becomes 16. So you might want to strategize and say, oh, I'm going to try to get this thing to like, actually, it is still producing a thin mesh here. So yeah, let me delete the inside part of that. Delete hidden. So yeah, this thing is like 180 polys. So I could probably get a face that's around, a face and head maybe that's around 500, 800 polys, right? And if I do the math, let's do calculator. So let's say I go for 800. I would go 800 times 4. Times 4 gets me to about 12,000, right? So again, I usually wind up going around 2,000 polys because times 4 gets me to 8,000. Or if I'm at 2,500 times 4, that's 1 division, is 10, which hits your base number between 7 and 10, right? So again, let's pretend this is the whole head, but I would simply go divide once. Let's say dividing twice gets me to my number. I'll delete the lower, so this is now my low res. And then once I do a project all, right? Project all. Again, if you have problems with projection, it's usually the distance isn't quite there, so I could either smooth the weird results and then project all. A lot of times I'll smooth and project, or I'll adjust the projection distance a little bit higher, so it's within the distance range. So now you got a really good clean topology for your base, right? I do believe, yeah, there's a center line thing happening here. This is, I may have to clean up that center edge. BZM. Yeah, I think there's some weird creasing happening on that line. So I'd have to figure out why that's working, but for the most part, this will work at getting you a really good clean topology as well. So
take those two lines and bring them down to one. The one that you just.
Yeah, I think I have to do some welding or merging there, you know. But yeah, if you're gonna go kind of the lower poly route where you're in that sort of 2000 poly range, like I said, you want to kind of follow a good template. You know, this is actually fairly good. Again, you do want to try to avoid triangles as much as possible. But you know, these are sort of really good guidelines overall. So yeah, I've got a Pinterest board if you want to, I guess I've posted it on the Facebook group, but I've got a lot of different examples of sort of facial topology. I think this one actually here is really, really good. Right, it's the right amount of loops, the right kind of layout. We will get this area. This is called a pole, by the way, when you have more than 4 edges that come into a single point. So a lot of times you'll have a pole here in along the side of the nose and a pole here. You might wonder, well, why do we care about poles? Well, the reason is, you know, a pole, like this is a pole right here. This may cause a pinching or a dimpling or some kind of weird surface result when you smooth. It may not look that way in Zbrush, but it might in Maya, it might in Unreal Engine, it might in some other software. Usually these things are strategically placed, so a pole here isn't necessarily a bad spot because it might look a bit like a dimple, right? A pole up here may not look bad, or maybe closer to the nostril because the nostril turns and is indented there anyway. So if there's a little indentation or something, it looks more natural there. You don't want it up along here, okay? And so yeah, my general rule for things like eyes, let me just clear that. So yeah, my general rule for eyes and mouths is basically, you know, if we're drawing an eye, oops, make sure I'm in a brush here. It's the worst thing when you're between softwares and you're confusing all your shortcuts. So yeah, I almost draw an eye out like it's kind of low res mesh, right? So this is kind of the little corner of the eye. So I actually usually like the eye to be what am I doing here? Sorry, let me undo this. Let's make a new layer. So yeah, the eye, right, there's kind of the high point. It arcs down a bit, comes down. I usually actually like to make my eyes square in low res. There's a low point, goes up a bit higher. So this is actually the way I generally draw out my topology. So this would be that inner corner of the eye, the tear duct, right? And then I match the number of loops, right? So if I have a loop up here, I want to match that loop up here. And I want them to fan out, so they radiate outwards. I usually delete this whole interior range here. I delete this because when I bring it to Maya or whatever, an eyeball is going to be sitting there. So I'll usually extrude it in and back. I'm not going to be as focused on that, so you can just kind of leave the mesh here and like leave it a bit messier. We'll deal with this a bit later on when we go to blend shapes. And then it's as simple as, right? Doesn't that look good? So that's really what it's all about when it comes to face topology. And the mouth is almost exactly the same. So if I do a new layer for the mouth, right, we have up, down, and maybe a little corner.
You know how you the lines on above the eye and below it, they have to match? Suppose at the top there's 5 and at the bottom there's 6. Then one of the 6 has to come off, right?
I usually like to keep them even top and bottom. If you're one off, it's not the worst thing in the world. It's okay. It's allowable. We'll put it that way. But I would recommend you try to keep it consistent, right? Oops, let's do this. Now we're doing this with the mouth closed. Eventually, we're going to do this with the mouth open. So I'll show you that. So again, loop, 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 right? Eventually we will do a version with the mouth open for blend shape, so we will have to kind of tweak this at some point. Yeah, something like that. But actually, when the mouth is open, what I usually like to do, so this would be the mouth open, and the corners, like I said, I almost always do 3 loops at the corners. So this would be if the mouth were open. I'm going to let you guys get away with a little fudginess here, but we generally want the loops to, here, let me undo that a bit. So yeah, usually I'd actually want this to be square. But I'll let you guys, like I said, get away with something like this. And it's, again, same thing, right? Oops. Circular loops, right? That radiate outwards. Spider-Man. Think of, that's the way I always describe it, Spider-Man mask. It's not quite the same, but yeah, it's like, you know, you have a point and they radiate out from that point. So there is, if you just look this up, the topology brush explains virtually everything you need to know about it. Really short article if you Google it, Zbrush topology brush. There's ZRemesh, and you can check out ZRemesher, right, for creating cleaner topology. And I personally don't use this tool, but if you guys want to, you can look up Quad Draw. I believe you just simply export a version of your mesh. So I could show you guys that quickly before wrapping up here. So let's say you take your Dynamesh head. Now you want to be careful. If it's super high res, it will slow you down a lot in Maya, but let's go back to Maya for a sec. Make a new scene. File, import. Yeah, where to go? This one. So yeah, you basically, I believe, make sure your symmetry object X is on, and then there's quad draw. Quad. Oops. Got to make sure we select the mesh here. So now. Yeah, I have no idea how this works, actually. I've never used it, but yeah, there's pretty good tutorials online for it. So yeah, you might prefer Maya's tools. I don't really care how you do it as long as you do it well, right? So anyways, I think that's it. Are there any questions, or is everybody good?